Support for this episode of Judaism Unbound comes from the Oshman family JCC in Palo Alto, California, whose vision is to be the architects of the Jewish future. The Oshman family JCC empowers you to experience Jewish paths toward a life of joy, purpose, and meaning through innovative Jewish learning and wellness programs, community building, and initiatives to develop the next generation of Jewish leaders. Learn more at www.paloaltojcc.org. This is Judaism Unbound, episode 433. Judaism is about love. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Liebenson.
And I'm Lex Rofberg.
And today's guest is a returning guest. Shai Held is a dear friend of mine for over 3 decades, which is absolutely frightening. He's the rabbi who officiated at my wedding just about 24 years ago, which is even more incredible. And significantly for our listeners, he's one of the leading Jewish theologians of our time. The jumping off point for our conversation today is Shai Held's newest book, Judaism is About Love, Recovering the Heart of Jewish Life. It argues that love is foundational in Judaism and that it is this central commitment to love that animates Judaism's particular perspectives on injustice and protest, grace, family life, and responsibilities to our neighbors and even to our enemies. We can't wait to jump in, but actually we will wait for a second because, Lex, the people want to know who some of the speakers, teachers, and session leaders for Shavuot Live are going to be. Now, remember that Shavuot Live is our annual 24-hour Jewish learning extravaganza, which is coming up in just over a week. It's from Saturday, June 8th at 5 p.m. Eastern Time for a full 24 hours all the way through Sunday, June 9th at 5 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Lex, is this information that you're ready to share with our listeners?
It absolutely is information I'm happy to share with our listeners. As you said, Shavuot Live is the greatest thing of all time, truly the GOAT of Jewish events. But here are some of our speakers. We announced on social media that we've got Abby Stein and Jericho Vincent and Katsira Lesser and Arthur Waskow, who are all teaching. I'm not going to give full bios of these folks, just about all of them. I think all that I just named are past guests on the podcast. We also have a number of amazing folks. I'm not going to list them all, but as a teaser for our amazing Shavuot Live lineup, we have Susan Katz-Miller, Zvika Krieger, Liz Goldstein, some amazing folks, and also members of our own Judaism Unbound team, Dan included, me included. So we are so excited for Shavuot Live. Can't wait to hang out with all of you there. There's 600 folks already registered. So if you're not one, what are you doing? Be 601.
Amazing. I'm so excited about all of this. So head over to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's SHAVUOT to register, and it's absolutely free. So now let's dive into our conversation with Shai Held. In the introduction to Judaism is About Love, Shai Held writes about an interview where he was asked what he thought about people who found his interpretations of the Jewish tradition compelling, but who didn't subscribe to his theological assumptions or commitments. Well, that was episode 49 of Judaism Unbound from our very first year. And while we've talked about many books in the introductions to our episodes, I think it's the first time that Judaism Unbound has appeared in the introduction of a book. So 7 years later, this conversation is coming full circle. Before we get into it, just a few more words of introduction for our guest today. Shai Held is president and dean of the Hadar Institute in New York City. He's a theologian and Bible scholar and one of the most influential Jewish leaders and thinkers in America. Shai Held is the recipient of the prestigious Covenant Award for Excellence in Jewish Education, and he's been named multiple times in Newsweek's list of the most influential rabbis in America, as well as the Forward's list of the most influential Jews in the world. Shai Held received rabbinic ordination and an MA in Jewish philosophy from the Jewish Theological Seminary and a PhD from Harvard University in religious studies. So without further ado, Shai Held, welcome back to Judaism Unbound. It's so great to have you again.
Thank you, Dan. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to just reflect on the title of your book and the word that I understood the least in the title, but the word is love. You say Judaism is about love. And I understand, and we'll talk about later, how that contrasts with the general idea that Christianity is about love and Judaism is about law. But I want to understand, when you say love, what do you mean?
Great. I think it's a really important question. And I want to clarify, if I can, by beginning with what it's not. When I say love in a religious context, I don't primarily mean an emotion. I mean a disposition. That is, a disposition to feel certain ways, to act certain ways, or maybe better, a way of holding ourselves in the world, an orientation. The term that I coined that is very pretentious, but I found it very helpful in my own thinking, love is an existential posture. Now, a disposition has to manifest in moments of emotion, or it's not really a disposition, or if it is, it will fade, but it itself is not synonymous with an emotion. And that's very important because if we're talking about orienting our lives around love, we can't orient our lives around a feeling because all feelings are ephemeral, they come and go. I always like to say you have to meditate for precisely 15 seconds to know that emotions don't stay at the surface. So you can say to me on a given day, what's your primary feeling tone today? And I'll say, I don't know, I'm grumpy and frustrated. But if you say, what's your orientation? I can still say coherently, or at least on a good day, I'm oriented around love. For whatever it's worth, I think it's helpful to really be clear that we're not saying love equals feeling for two crucial reasons. One is if you tell people that spirituality requires feeling love all the time, either they will end up lying to themselves about what they feel, right? They'll develop a shadow self because they're invested in denying other things that they also feel, or they'll just give up because they'll say totally reasonably, I can't feel that all the time. So it's important to me. I'm not making some abstract philosophical point. I mean, it may also be that, but I'm trying to make a point about how we can function as real humans in the real world and talk about being oriented about love without falsifying the sheer complexity of our experience.
When we say Judaism is about love, when I see my children, I mean, I know what it means to love my children, but I'm not sure what it means to love a stranger. I don't think
Right.
it's saying love a stranger the way I love my children. So I think we're talking about a different definition of love. And I'm trying to understand exactly what the love is that Judaism is about.
So I think that's a wonderful question. And of course, I agree with you. I do not love the stranger and love my daughter in the same way. One thing that might be helpful is I think that love is more of an umbrella term for a series of postures than it is one distinct posture. Recently, a bunch of moral philosophers have started arguing in the same way that discussions about love often get tripped up by the illusion that love is one thing. Rather, love is an umbrella for things like care, wishing well, compassion, generosity, kindness. I would even argue that gratitude is a species of love. I think it's important to clarify that because otherwise, if you say to someone, love your neighbor, and they're like, well, what do you mean love my neighbor? I can only love a certain number of people. And I'd say that's a distinctive kind of love that you're talking about, but there are others. I'll mention, Dan, that it was interesting to me in the process of working on this book, the moment when I realized that in Babylonian Aramaic, this is going to sound very obscure, but it's really not. In Babylonian Aramaic, in the Aramaic of the Talmud, there is no way to distinguish mercy and compassion on the one hand from love on the other. That is, the Aramaic root for love is resh chet mem, more commonly known to people who speak Hebrew as a term for mercy.
And it's also related to the word for womb, which I think sort of hints at what you're getting at.
Yeah, although that's controversial among linguists. It's a very common argument among feminist scholars that the root for womb and the root for mercy are the same. Some scholars are skeptical of that. I don't feel qualified to assess that. It's certainly an argument that emerges over time in the history of interpretation, for sure.
And just to clarify for people who might have heard the Hebrew word, the word you're talking about in Hebrew is rachamim, in Aramaic, rachmana.
Rachama, right, exactly. So I found it interesting as a way of just sort of realizing, oh, I'm not crazy here in thinking that love is an umbrella that includes a lot of things. So, of course, I don't think the idea is to have a heart-melting reaction every time I see a human being. It's about being oriented towards their well-being, not having my fundamental posture towards others to be being hostility. In the case of loving the stranger, it's about quelling whatever impulse to xenophobia I might have or I might have picked up. I mean, it's that kind of thing.
I like the title, Judaism is about love. It's one of the only titles I've seen where it's itself a thesis statement. I'm trying to think of other titles. Like I'm sure there's examples that I'm not thinking of right now, but it's helpful in that way.
It's interesting, Lex. I had a whole back and forth with the team at FSG, at Farrar, Straus and Giroux, my publisher, about this because it was so unusual. And I had several friends who said, that's not a book title, that's a sentence. And my editor at FSG was like, I like this. It just comes right out and says what you're going to do. And because it's counterintuitive to many people, it's a provocation. It makes someone pick up the book and say, oh, that's interesting. I wasn't expecting that.
I'm also really interested in the term love, and I want to do like a weird parallel. When we talk about love in religious context, I think for all the reasons you just were talking about, we're talking about a lot of different things. And that's not true of every like big noun or verb that holds religious space. I'm thinking of the parallel of like creation, to use another word that I think comes up in religious context. We have a distinction in English between like creation, which I think when you talk about creation, often people flash to like the creation, like creation myths of the world, how things came to be. But then we have creativity, which is a different word. And I think for a lot of us, it takes us into the sheerly human realm, like creativity. Like, yeah, God can be creative, I guess. But when we talk about God's elements of the verb create, I think creation or creator are more common. With love, there's really not like different formats of it in English that get at the love of God on the one hand or the love by God on the other versus the love that humans have for each other. They're all like one word love. I think it's both a challenge and like a really amazing, exciting opportunity. And I wanted to ask about that because if I'm being fully honest, and this has come up when you've been on the show in the past, I'm a pantheist. And so whenever one talks about, and I see myself as like Jewishly pantheist and following a lineage, I don't see myself as just like generally pantheist, but when people talk about love by God of humanity or love by humanity of God, it's challenging to me because for me, I don't pose an external thing, God, that I am sort of in relationship with outside of me. I understand myself as part of God. And so, I mean, you could argue that then love becomes self-love, and maybe that's good. Or love of anything is sort of an extension of godly love if I think that all existence is God. But it's hard to really talk about in that way from my theological place. So I'd love to get from your voice, how can we begin to open up the differences between love of God by us on the one hand, love by God towards us, and then love among us, love among humanity as framing mechanism?
I'll just say about where you started that it's interesting. In English, I mean, I've had this experience many times in teaching it. When I say that I want to talk about the love of God, it isn't immediately clear to my listeners whether I'm talking about humans loving God or God loving humans, right? Which is really quite interesting in a way. And that leads me to want to say something else, which is kind of not part of the book, but that's interesting, is that you have this idea that appears especially in Hasidic sources that there's a kind of mirror effect, that the way I love God is the way God loves me. This is something that Hasidim say about Psalm 121, in which we say, God is your shadow on your right hand. And they say the shadow, the tzel in Hebrew, that God is, means that the texture of my love for God becomes the texture of God's love for me. I don't think that's meant to be mechanistic. I think that's some kind of deep psychological insight, that the kind of love I'm able to give is the kind of love I'm able to receive. You can't receive what you're not willing to give. If you walk into shul on Yom Kippur and say, Dear God, for all the ways that I've hurt people, I hope you'll forgive me. But as for the ways that other people have hurt me, I hope you punish every last one of them and give them their due. That is psychologically incoherent. I don't think that it actually makes human sense. So I'm saying all this because I think there is a kind of really deep and intrinsic link between loving God and being loved by God, and that the textures impact on each other. To your second point, as you know, and as we've talked about on past episodes, I am very much not a pantheist. For me, my primary intuition of the world, if you will, is dialogical, right? Is about God is not me, I am not God. You are not me, I am not you. And that's actually what makes the sacred possible. That is the between space. When I talk about God loving us, I mean something genuinely relational, where it gets, I don't know if complicated is the right word, but maybe paradoxical, is that in order for there to be a loving relationship, there has to be first an acknowledgement of otherness. I can't love you if I'm busy imagining that you're an extension of my will. I'll say that in the writing of this book, one of the most interesting moments for me in my own experience was when I came to realize how much of what I was saying about parenting and how much of what I was saying about theology in the chapter on God were directly mirroring of each other without any intentionality for it to work out that way. I like to talk about how Martin Buber, as a young man, when he writes his classic I Am Now, he begins with the famous statement, in the beginning was the relation, right? He says, we're constituted by the way we interact with other things. But then when he gets older, he says, it's not quite true that in the beginning is the relation. In the beginning, and here he sounds like the German that he is, in the beginning is the primal setting at a distance, which is just a ridiculous way of saying the acknowledgement that you are not me and you are your own will and your own consciousness, and there can be no relation until I acknowledge that otherness. I mean, that is like rule number one of good parenting. Your child is not an extension of your will or a playing out of the way you wish your life had gone. Part of what it means for God to love us is for God not to intervene all the time to clean up our messes. God has to allow us and the world that we're in to be other than God.
My follow-up, because you did give a beautiful window into that funniness of the English language, where love is not clearly, when you first introduce it, about God loving us versus us loving God. The third piece, us loving one another, I will say personally, those are the elements of your book that I found really most meaningful. I mean, I also found other parts of your book to be resonant, or even when they're not, pushing me in productive ways. But talk to us about love among humanity, because I think liturgically, you even in your beginning, I mean, and the most famous aphorisms Jewishly about God, I'm not going to say the most important, but I think they are often God related, whether it is God loving us or us loving God. Ve'ahavta, the Shema, like that is a relational statement of love regarding primarily God and humanity. Ahavat Olam, Ahava Rabbah, these liturgical pieces, all of them start there. We could argue they're more expansive than just God and humanity, but talk to us about love among human beings, love of the stranger, love of enemies was another part of your book. How can we start to expand our notions of the love that Judaism is about beyond just the love of God?
Thank you for that. I think maybe I'll start by sharing one of the texts and ideas that I found most resonant because I experienced it as so countercultural. In trying to explain what love of your neighbor can mean, Ramban Nachmanides, one of the great medieval Jewish Bible commentators, basically begins by saying, it's unreasonable to think that I'm going to love other people to the same extent or in the same way as I love myself. And what he ends up saying, and this depends a tiny drop on a Hebrew analysis, so let me see if I can say this in an accessible way. Ve'avta lireacha kamocha, as opposed to ve'avta et reacha kamocha, which he understands to mean love for your neighbor as yourself, as opposed to love your neighbor as yourself. What he ends up saying is that this is about a certain kind of generosity of spirit, where I want you to have everything that I do, and I'd like you to have it to the same extent that I do. And while that may at first sound like, okay, that's lovely, it's incredibly difficult, because one of the things I learned as a Hillel rabbi, this was a long time ago now, but it was really formative for me, was how much college students, in a really unself-conscious way, how much of their sense of self-worth was purchased by comparison and competition. Oh, I may feel bad about myself, but at least I'm the smartest person in my math class. Or, I may feel like I'm not successful, but at least I have a higher position than you do. The problem with that is that it only ever offers fool's gold, because anyone who feels good about themselves because they're smarter than someone will inevitably meet someone who they think is smarter than they are. So the culture of acquiring self-esteem by comparison is really insidious on a whole array of different levels. I feel like what Nachmanides is talking about here is resisting that whole way of being. I don't need you to have less than I do. I don't need you to be less than I am. That particular lens on loving your neighbor just honestly for me resonated very deeply, and it ties to a very kind of a robustly theological idea that our self-worth is something that we always already have rather than needing to earn. Lex, what I'm really groping for here is a way of talking about what does it mean to see people in the most generous possible way, to want them to flourish, to want them to have blessings. So that's what I would say is sort of step one of interpersonal love. Now, if I could add one piece, Lex, you talked about love. You mentioned specifically love of the stranger. This is one of the places where the Bible enacts a kind of moral revolution that's worth taking a minute to dwell on. To the best of our knowledge, historically, in the ancient Near East, there were a range of cultures that were preoccupied with the welfare of the widow and the orphan. They are the paradigmatic, vulnerable people in antiquity. Think about a patriarchal society. A widow and an orphan are people who do not have an adult male to look after them. The Bible, of course, picks up on this preoccupation with widows and orphans, but it doesn't stop there. It expands the category of widow and orphan to widow, orphan, and stranger. Stranger is someone who is not a member of your kin group and therefore is vulnerable to exploitation. The Bible expands from a vision of protecting our vulnerable to a vision of protecting the vulnerable. Protecting our vulnerable would be a lot, right? But protecting the vulnerable is a radical move against this sort of xenophobic impulse of kind of othering the other, if you will. Now, that's not the only impulse in the Bible, to be sure. And it's important to me in my work not to sort of just do apologetics and make believe everything in the tradition is beautiful and unproblematic and unsullied. That's not my point at all. But I do think love of the stranger is really central, and it's a dramatic moment. And it ought to orient how we think about immigrants, which is what a ger is, what a stranger is someone who came to dwell amongst you. Yeah, you're supposed to love your neighbor, that's a lot, but that's not it. 15 verses later, I'm going to throw a stick of dynamite and say, and also the stranger. That's, I think, really powerful and really hard to do, which is why most of us, I guess, most of the time kind of domesticate it or don't think about it.
Shai, I'm going to give you a big wind-up to this question, but ultimately I think it's about God and the way that God is the prime mover, in a sense, to the argument of your book. But I want to get into the structure of your book, what the book is trying to be about, and why. And I know you start the book talking about wanting to say that Judaism is about love because most people think that Christianity is about love, and that's actually my next question. But let's assume that that's a given. I understood the structure of your book to be basically two things, but tell me if it's more. One is just like, let me tell you why that's wrong. Let me tell you all the ways that Judaism is about love, number one. But also, I think that there's kind of an inherent argument there that you make. And the thing is that I don't think it needs to be made, and this is where I want to talk about, that Judaism being about love flows and perhaps must flow from a belief that God loves us. And the reason that I'm asking about it is because, back to what you were saying earlier, you make some analogies to parenting. Do I love my children because I created them? Because one could imagine that somebody who is like a sperm donor or an egg donor also created children that they don't love. And I think that the reason I love my children is because essentially they live in my household. The reason I love my spouse, is because I chose her. The love is something that comes, I think in part at least, there's different kinds of love, because obviously I also love family that I didn't choose, that I was born into a relationship with them. But when we talk about the parent-child relationship, I guess I'm saying that I think that you put a lot of weight on the idea that God created us and therefore must love us. I don't know that that follows, and I guess I'm asking how you know that. Is that just a belief that the sources that we have, like the Torah, are from God and it says that? Like, how do we know anything about God? And if the implication of knowing something about God is how we must live our lives, it gets me a little stuck. And the last thing I want to say is that I've been thinking about this a lot lately and saying, like, maybe there's just like a user interface issue in the sense that 2,000 years ago, if I had come into a room, or 3,000 years ago, and said to a bunch of people, hey, I just had a great idea, we should love the stranger, they would say, oh, well, I don't know, that doesn't sound so great. But if I came into the room and said, hey, I had a revelation that God told us that we should love the stranger, they would say, tell me more. I'm interested. Whereas in our time, it's exactly the opposite, right? If I come into a room and say, God tells me to love the stranger, a lot of people will throw me out or try to lock me up, But if I come in and say, hey, I had a great idea, we should love the stranger, and let me tell you why, they might be more likely to listen. So I guess what I'm saying is, like, everything that you write, I agree with everything. I love everything. I want that Judaism. But I struggle with why it needs to be connected or how we can know anything fundamentally about God.
Does a contemporary Judaism of love need to be rooted in God? I don't feel like I'm invested in that question. I am not particularly engaged in the business of arguing you into it, right? I have in all our years together, Dan, never tried to convince you that there is a God. Like, it's just not my mode. So I say that because the reason I write this book in a way that is so focused on God is essentially twofold. One is that that's how I read the tradition's own understanding of where love stems from. And B, that's really integral to how I myself experience the world, at least much of the time. Now, if other people hear some of what I'm laying out and say, okay, I find some of this really congenial, but the kind of metaphysical underpinning just doesn't resonate with me. I mean, Lex has his own version of that, right? As he said earlier, of a metaphysical underpinning be different. So I would say, okay, it's not my project to do that for you. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, quite the contrary. I would like people who have different worldviews to take on some of these ideas and articulate them in the best way possible. But an example of this that I think about a lot is human rights theory, where there's this ongoing debate among human rights theorists about whether the idea that human rights inhere in a human being in a pre-political way is coherent without a God idea. It's related to the question of whether you can talk about intrinsic dignity without God. And I would like those who say you can have a robust notion of dignity without God to be right, because I would like everyone in the world to one day believe in dignity, and I'm not confident that everyone will one day believe in God, or at least not in some pre-messianic, whatever we mean by that world. But I don't see it as my project, particularly, to work on secular notions of dignity. I hope secular thinkers keep doing that. So that's like the first thing that I would say, like, well, it's what my project is. And it's interesting. I was thinking about this a lot this week, but I think someone else asked me, what work can you do to help atheists connect to the Judaism you're describing? It brought me up short a little bit because my first reaction was, wait, why am I being asked to do that work? Like, that's not my worldview. And again, not out of like laziness or disdain, quite the contrary, out of, wait a minute, let me give you the raw material. I've spent a lot of years gathering a tremendous amount of stuff. You tell me, right? And look, I mean, this is important to me in general. Like, I'm in favor of, let's just coin a term, worldview dialogue, right? One of the problems that we have in the contemporary world, one of the many ones, is that I have a way of seeing the world. I assume it's the truth. Therefore, everyone who experiences or sees the world differently must be wrong, and I have to either convince them or belittle them. So much of the religious way of talking about non-religious people is fundamentally condescending, and much of the way that many contemporary atheists talk about religious people is equally condescending. I would prefer when someone says to me, wait a minute, I don't see the world through a God-shaped lens at all, that my reaction be, tell me about that, as opposed to, let me convince you. Obviously, there are limits. If you tell me I experience the world, in ways that, I don't know, this type of person is obviously inferior and less than human, I'll say, okay, I have some boundaries. But look, I think, you've heard me say this many times, I think we live in a world that is fundamentally ambiguous. I think there are very good reasons to believe in God. I think there are some very good reasons not to believe in God. And I think that ought to induce in us a posture of humility and an openness to conversation, right? Because I know that sometimes when I talk, Dan, you look at me and you're like, I love you, but you're speaking Martian. Sometimes when you describe the world to me, I'm like, really? That's how you see it? I don't find that doesn't resonate for me at all. And we talk about it. By the way, that's also a dimension of love.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But just to clarify, the question that I'm asking is not really so much about belief versus non-belief. It's like within the context of belief. Let's say that we accept belief in God as a given. You write in the book that when you talk to your children, you tell them that I love you more than anything you could possibly imagine, and God loves you even more. And I want to say, how do you know that? Because I don't think it follows naturally from because God created us. I know, Rabbi Akiva thought that or whoever, but I don't see that argument. I'm struggling with that argument.
Aha. So I would say two things about this. First of all, I would not use the word that I know that. And I'm not trying to be a pedant here, but as I think epistemologically for me, it's important not to be overconfident. I don't know very much about God at all. I believe a lot of things about God, but uncertainty is built into anytime we're talking about ultimate things, on some level, you're talking, about uncertainty. That said, I think that it's a combination of my experience and the texts that shape me. And it's important to me to try to be self-aware about the fact that those two things cannot fully be teased apart. After however many years of being totally immersed in thinking about learning, teaching these texts, what is my intuition and what is textually formed, if you will, it's very hard to tease apart. I mean, it's funny, as I'm saying that, I'm remembering that, my main critique of Heschel in my book about him, my first book was about Abraham Joshua Heschel as a philosopher and a theologian, is that I thought Heschel was insufficiently aware of the ways that his intuitions were not universal, but always already shaped by Jewish culture. So that when he talks about wonder as a human experience, I thought he did not give enough attention to, no, it's not that you have experiences and then the Psalms, lo and behold, have the same experiences. It's that your experience is already shaped by the Psalms. So when you say to me, like, how do I know that? Part of my answer is, of course I don't know that. But the way I experience the world is shaped by that, meaning we're all on some level caught in a certain kind of circularity. But my orientation is very, very traditional in ways that continue to surprise even me as I get older. I mean traditional in a very specific way. I really feel that my task as a philosopher and theologian, or maybe even more simply, as an interpreter of the tradition, is to start with the assumption that what it says is true, and then bring it into conversation with the world and see how that affects what I'm able to see about those texts. The first person to read this book when I finished the first draft of it was, someone who's been a very important teacher to me, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who's an Orthodox rabbi, right? And one of Yitz's first reactions when he finished the book was, "You are so frum." Because I had said at some point,
from being
like very traditionally pious. Why did he say that? Because in the chapter on chosenness, when I start playing around with different ways we might think about election and chosenness, I say, I don't want to stray too far from tradition. And he's like, well, why not? Mm-hmm. It's a certain mode of, I really dislike the word piety, but it probably applies. There's a certain mode of piety that I have. Like it's partially my own posture in relationship to Torah.
I think that's really important. And I'm not saying this to distance us from you. I hope it's different from how we go about it. Like a lot of Judaism Unbound's everything is taking textual tradition and other than textual tradition, holidays, whatever, and asking and starting not from the point that it's let's go with true and find out what we learned there, but asking is it true? And often saying no. I wanted to sort of carry that forward, I think. So we talked about how crystal clear in many ways your title is, but I also think there's a little bit of a beautiful ambiguity to it. So Judaism is about love. People could hear that a number of ways. It could be heard as the textual tradition of Judaism, like a certain set of texts, Bible, liturgy, rabbinic texts are about love. It could also be heard, like I'm imagining there could be, and maybe I'm stretching, but like there could be maybe to go really starkly different. There could be a book called Judaism About Love that is, say, about Jewish anarchists and socialists. You could write a book with the title Judaism is About Love where you explore, and it's funny, it's kind of similar to what you said about Abraham Joshua Heschel. There are things that people do and see as just human tendencies that are sometimes deeply inflected by their Jewishness, their Jewish heritage, even Jewish texts, Jewish culture, Jewish communities, etc. One realm where that's the case is activism historically. And like you could have a book that has the same title as yours that is not about classic Jewish textual tradition primarily, but is instead about look at all of these different Jewish communities over time who have embodied Jewish notions of love, maybe some textual notions, but like they have lived commitments of love to human beings, to stranger, to other Jews, to the world, to humanity, like through this realm of what we tend to term activism, or like we tend not to call that the primary like religious realm. I think we're caught in Godland on that front, and that's part of my struggle as a pantheist. But like, is this book, Judaism About Love, where you chronicle primarily the textual tradition of Judaism, where we have oodles and oodles and oodles of different pathways of love of God, love by God to us, love of the stranger, love of the enemy? Like, is that one part, and then somebody else could go and channel like, here are other manifestations of Jewish love that are not because we can point to a verse in certain texts, but rather that we can point to an Emma Goldman or an Emma Lazarus. I'm just going with Emma's, I guess. Pick your favorite set of Jews who are not primarily seen as textually anchored, but who still are living Jewishness very consciously and still channeling love. Like, is that another angle, or is that a different angle? Is that like somebody could write that as a sequel, or is it like its own thing?
That's a really interesting question. I think that the textual tradition has priority. That goes back to my being a traditionalist in that way. But I don't think it has exclusivity. I think there are all kinds of things you could say. I mean, one of the most interesting, I think, kind of almost social scientific things to explore is the ways in which so many different modern Jewish secularities chose aspects of caring for the vulnerable as the essence of what they wanted to preserve. And how much of that was implicitly based on something textual, how much of it was based on something emotional, cultural, right? There's like a lot to say there. You know, one of the things I was thinking about when you asked me that question, Lex, and I'm a little hesitant to say this because I'm not sure I believe it, but I'll try it on, is that some of the books you were describing, I would be inclined to title them Jewishness is About Love rather than Judaism is About Love. Because I still think that Judaism refers to, and not just texts, practices, traditions, right? It's not just like a library. It's a living, vibrant religious culture. Kaplan might have said a religious civilization. If you were to ask me to talk about, I don't know, American secular Jewish radicals who were focused on taking care of immigrants, I think my impulse would be to say their Jewishness was about love, but I'm not sure that dichotomy really makes a lot of sense to me. So I can either withdraw it, or you can delete this, or I can.
No, we're going to keep this, and I'm surfacing to our listeners that like I do find the distinction between Jewishness and Judaism, which I think mirrors a broader distinction that we draw between Jewish religion or Judaism and Jewish culture. I do find it impoverished. And I love that you're trying it on, right? Like, I'm very comfortably in a space where I like, you could use the word conflate. I conflate, quote unquote, things Jews do with Judaism to a degree that I think some people would critique.
Yeah, what I would say is I don't think the distinction is impoverished. I think the distinction needs to be dialectically counterweighed with something very different, which is, what is Judaism if not how Jewishness is expressed? I mean, right, there's a lot to say here. I think it's worth saying or asking, is there some distinction we still want to uphold between, I don't know, what some reading of the tradition says on the one hand, and what contemporary Jews do in expressing their Jewish identity on the other? I would want to say, yes, that is not meant to be a wall, but it is still meant to be a distinction. I want to just observe that when I say that kind of we start with the assumption, or I start with the assumption that what the tradition says is true, whatever that means, I don't mean by that ever that my reading of the sources is allowed to bulldoze the reality of human experience. I mean, the example of this that I often give is, I often say that a posek halacha, halachic decision maker, when asked a question, first, she has to go to the sources, find out what they say, arrive at her best reading of what, cumulatively the tradition holds. And then, no less importantly, she has to go to people's lives and see how interacting with that conclusion that she's reached would affect those people's lives, and understand that the reality of those people's lives is also Torah. And that means that I have to go back to the tradition and at a certain point understand that it can't be saying what I initially thought it was saying. Now, from a certain kind of more secularized perspective, you might say, oh, come on, why can't you just say the tradition said something, but it was wrong? But as someone who approaches the tradition as revelation, again, whatever we mean by tradition and revelation, that doesn't feel like it's one of the options in the game that I'm playing, game in a totally non-pejorative sense, right? But I can say, and I have said, and I do say, I don't know what Leviticus means by that, because the Torah of people's lives has forced me to believe that a revelation of God's will can't be something that I know is unfathomably cruel.
So clearly we're living in title land, or at least I am. And so I'm thinking about a lot of my questions in terms of the title of your book. That's often how I go. I think an equally correct title from a certain perspective could have been Judaism is not about love, if that makes sense. And that would be the defensive version, right? But there's an element of your book that we need to say, like, I don't want to say defensive in like a pejorative way. Like, there's an element of your book that is responding to millennia of, I would say, anti-Jewish sentiment, anti-Semitism, where people have in fact said that Judaism is not about love. It's not like you just sort of said this out of thin air. It is a response to people. And I will say personally, and you can frame this however you want, I think it is a huge problem, the degree to which both Christians and even like culturally Christian or like secular people are not fully aware of the deepness of this notion that Judaism is about a set of things that are not love, that Judaism is about nitty-gritty laws and all the stuff that we sort of push aside and not important. Like, I don't think people have really reckoned with that. And I think, especially honestly, folks who identify as secular or just culturally Christian haven't reckoned with that. And it still operates in really significant ways. So can you talk to us about the ways in which not only is this book about how Judaism is about love, it's also about how Christians are wrong when they say Judaism is not about love?
Yeah, I love the way you formulated that. So I want to say that my first audience, my primary audience is not Christians who think that about Judaism. It's Jews who've internalized the Christian bias about Judaism. This book goes back about 25 years to an experience I had that I share in the opening pages of this book that really shook me. And in retrospect, looking back over the course of my life and career, had a massive, massive impact on me, far more massive than I realized at the time. I was speaking to a group of fifth-year rabbinical students at the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, kind of flagship of the conservative movement. And in passing, I said, Judaism is a story of a God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. At which point one of the students said, pretty sneeringly, I'm sorry, but that just sounds like Christianity to me. I don't know what to say. I was heartbroken, crestfallen, a little confused. And I said to him, it's so interesting that you say that, because when I said what I said, I was thinking about the morning and evening Jewish liturgy, in which we say, Ahava rabba ahavtanu, with vast love have you, God, loved us. And then a moment later, we recite Deuteronomy chapter 6, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your being and all your might. A God who loves us and beckons us to love God back. So if you hear that and what you hear is Christianity, then I think we are long overdue for a conversation about how deeply we, even passionate, committed Jews, have internalized a Christian anti-Judaic story. We have to start there. And so in many ways, this book was written to help Jews climb out of that. If I had $1 for every time I'd been asked that, some version of that, I would be a very rich guy. And, by the way, in a similar vein, the number of times I've had students, even deeply knowledgeable students, say, wait a minute, grace is a Jewish idea? And I want to pull my hair out. How does something so fundamental come to seem alien? It's also the case that I've had many conversations with Christians in the same way. And a story that I've been sharing a lot lately that I did not include in the book that I now really wish I had is that a few months after that encounter with a rabbinical student, I was speaking to a group of Protestant high school students. And I said also in passing, it was not the main topic, I said, remind me, guys, what does Jesus say is the great command? And all 20 hands go up. And I call on one and he proudly tells me about love of God and love of neighbor. And then again, totally innocently, I follow with, and remind me now, what was Jesus quoting? And not a single hand goes up. This was unbelievable to me at the time. This is like my first foray into teaching Christians. And I was like, wait a minute. None of you know that Jesus is quoting Leviticus and Deuteronomy? None of you know that? I didn't say that. But I was so taken aback and I realized, so this is how Christianity has been able historically to tell a story about Judaism being a loveless religion and Christ coming into the world to introduce something totally new. None of you have any idea what Jesus was drinking, if you will, right? None of you know that. In a way, the secondary audience for me, and it's taken me obviously a much longer time to develop this audience, is Christians, many of whom I am finding really do understand that they need to find new and different ways of talking about Judaism, that what they were taught is obsolete and even obscene, but they don't know what to put in its place. And my hope is that in some small way, this book can provide some of that language that may be helpful as well for Christians. My primary audience is Jews. I'm trying to engage in an act of restoration and recovery, but it's not my only audience.
I want to ask you about how we go from the subject of your book, which is, understanding Judaism. What is Judaism about? What is Judaism saying? What is Judaism trying to get us to think and feel and do, to what we could call halakha, right? The actions that we use to do those things. And I want to talk about chesed. I want to talk about the idea that I think best translates, I learned this from you, that the best translation of chesed is grace. When you do something for somebody that they did not earn, that you do it for somebody because it's the right thing to do. By the by, I have a question about, can't we just call it grace? In other words, why do we have to call chesed or loving kindness or whatever? And I think there's a fear of using the word because it sounds like Christianity. I mean, it's the same issue, but that's parenthetical. You can answer that if you want. But really what I want to talk about is the acts of chesed. And in the last few days, as we're recording this, we lost a friend, Nancy Dubler, who was a person who you wrote on Facebook about how she showed chesed to you. And she showed it to me, and just she's a person. In other words, she's not a rabbi. She was a medical ethicist, but somebody who, in my view, lived out the application of chesed, of grace, of giving without an expectation of return, better than anybody. And in a way, I want to hold that up as Torah. I want to hold Nancy's actions up as Torah and to be able to say, this is how you do chesed. and this is not a criticism of your book. I mean, it's already like 550 pages. But I'm curious about maybe the sequel.
It's only about 306. Oh, what is it? It's less.
I know there's the 200 pages of notes, but
They're not for everyone.
No, but no, it is for everybody. I love the book, but I'm just saying, like, I'm kind of curious about the sequel. Not that you need to write it, but the one that says, because I think what Judaism is also about is not just thinking. Judaism is about doing, and of course, the implication of believing that you should love people is that you should act with love. But I think in the reality, in the real world, a lot of people don't know how to act with love. They don't know what to do. And sometimes just to have, so one thing for Nancy Dubler, for me, was a role model. I know that if there are friends of my children that are around and that don't have family around, I make them part of my family. But in a sense, what I'm worried about is that when we say to people, love the stranger, act with love towards those who have given you nothing, they say, yeah, okay, but what does that mean? How should I live my day differently? And I actually think Judaism is really good at that, at giving us like exact things to do. But I'm curious how we connect the way that I think, for example, that Judaism has been very good at telling us specific actions that flow from an orientation of love, and not just that we should mentally have that orientation.
I mean, the nicest compliment I ever got as a teacher, which I still think about a lot because I don't know that I deserved it, but I think about a lot, is that the journalist Eric Alterman said, what you're doing is really hard. You're asking people to think really deep and feel really deep at the same time. I think that is a very good description of what I'm trying to do. Whether I always do it is, of course, an open question. So I actually think that sharing stories of kindness with kids and with other people is enormously important, precisely because of what you just said. People don't always know. Well, first of all, let me share for a minute. It'll take a minute and remember Nancy. I was a kid who had lost his father very suddenly when I was 12 years old. I was left living alone with a mother who had no tools, emotional or otherwise, to take care of me. And I was like really on my own, sort of forced to raise myself in many ways. Now, when I look back on my life, I realize that on some level I was really alone, and on another level I was really not alone, because I had a bunch of people who, I don't know whether it was conscious or not, but intuited that my situation at home was much more broken than I even understood, and they opened their homes to me. And Nancy was one of those people. And one night I was over their house. I think it was one of the first or, the second or the third time I'd ever stayed over there. And Nancy and Walter sort of sat me down and handed me a key to their apartment. I was sort of a little confused, like, what is this? And they were like, don't ask, just come. Treat this place like you live here. And I did. I stayed at least one night a week at the Dublers' apartment until I graduated high school. And the thing about it was, it just flowed from a place of genuine goodness. It's a model for me. And I think it's really important to, one of the reasons I wrote about it on Facebook is yes, I'm using it as a place where I have lots of friends and I'm grieving and all of that. And I also think it's a piece of Torah. What might seem like a small act like that can radically transform another person's life. I always found it interesting that the rabbis of the Talmud offer like very concrete things. Give clothing to those who can't afford it. Visit the sick. Comfort those who are grieving. I think actually that one of the jobs of educators is to really communicate in word and in example that is the very highest thing a human being can do in this lifetime, right? And so I've had this conversation, I think you know this, with countless day school principals. Stop making it seem like the highest value of your school is getting into the Ivy League. Make it clear that the highest value of your school is that kids graduate kind and generous and big-hearted. Chesed, love manifested as kindness, is not an extracurricular activity so we can get back to what's important like math or basketball. It's it, right? It's the thing. It's where Torah, right? The way I talk to you is where Torah is real or isn't. This has to be woven into the way we build communal institutions, nursery schools, elementary schools, institutions that we create. I mean, it really breaks my heart the number of times I have heard people talk about working in Jewish organizations where they felt eaten alive. And I just feel like, well, so what is the point of any of this if it's going to be like that? And huge things are built of small things, right? To say something that sounds ridiculous. But the question of, is the Jewish community animated by love, is answered by the question of whether I said hi to that guy at Kiddush or not, or whether I, sent an email to someone and said, I know you're going through a lot right now. Just want you to know you're on my mind. That's the stuff.
I really appreciate you bringing that and emphasizing chesed. I think in the spirit, I think I'm going to, so I always have a little bit of wordplay. So the first thing I want to say is, on the day school front, we forget, this is going to be kitschy. When you start school, the first thing you do is you go to kindergarten. It starts with kinder. So throw that on the wall of the classroom. Like maybe we could benefit from thinking of the thesis statement, like you said, of being kinder human beings, not just, getting into the Ivy League. So actually, and there's something beautiful that the word kinder, meaning children, I don't know that it actually linguistically ties to notions of kindness and kinder. But related to that, I wanted to close channeling chesed through, some chassidism, graceism. There are some really powerful, for me, Jewish numerological applications of the word ahava, of love. And the most well-known, I think, in, certain Hasidic or neo-Hasidic circles is that the word for love in Hebrew, ahava, it has a value of 13. I think about this whenever I'm in an elevator in a hotel and there's no 13th floor, the love gap. But ahava is 13, and a common teaching is that that's the same value as echad, which is the number 1. And so there's this notion of unity, of oneness.
Just to clarify that, you're saying that it's the numerological value of the word for one, echad, equals 13.
Yes, sorry.
Confusingly.
When you add up the 3 letters of echad, it leads to 13, which is confusing. But I have been known to add to this equation, a literal equation, which is that when ahava, 13, meets ahava, another 13, when love meets love, the result is 26, which is Yud He Vav He. It's godliness, it's God, it's however we want to channel that 4-letter tetragrammaton of God. And so as a closing question, and I'm kind of coming full circle, but what I mean to convey when I say that is actually that relationality of love, that there is a depth to understanding ourselves as other than others and loving them even if they're not ourselves, loving them like we love ourselves. And so I just wanted to close with that notion of ahava, of love and relationality. As our listeners are going on to whatever's next in their life, they listen to this episode, they're off to make dinner, or they're off to pick up their kids from school, or whatever it is. What's that closing message about the importance of love? Maybe because it's part of Judaism, but maybe because it's part of humanity.
It's funny, when you were talking, I was brought back to a text that I want to mention very quickly, which is a statement in the Talmud that says the beginning of Torah is acts of loving kindness and the end of the Torah is acts of loving kindness. Obviously, we should not read that in a tone-deaf way. It's not describing what comes in Genesis 1 and the end of Deuteronomy. It's suggesting when you say the beginning and end of X is Y, what you're really saying is X is in the world for the purpose of Y. Occasionally, when people would say to me, Judaism is about love, where does it say that? I would say, well, first of all, it says it everywhere. But second of all, the Talmud literally says that. It says the beginning and end of Torah is love. I think what I would say as a closing message is something that I say in passing in the book, but that is very important to me. We should aspire to live in a way that there is a seamlessness between whether or not I hold the door for the person behind me and whether I care about human rights. Being oriented around caring about people is not like an episodic thing It's not like a checklist thing. It really is an orientation, which is why that word was so fundamental and important to me. It is an orientation, a way of comporting ourselves. Love begets love, right? Chesed begets chesed. When you do an act of love in the world, you plant seeds of further love. I thought that's where you were going to go, Lex, when you talked about a kindergarten, a garden for growing children, which is what that word means. It's like you're planting seeds and let them blossom into vehicles for the expression of love, which is one of the things we are as human beings.
Thank you so much, Shai Held, for joining us once again. This has been a fantastic conversation.
Thank you so much. It's always a privilege to be with you guys.
And thanks so much to all of you out there for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this conversation, and we hope that you'll tune in again in the future. We wanted to close out this episode by, again, pleading with you, encouraging you. Go to Shavuot Live. It's the best event ever. You can sign up for it by heading to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. That's SHAVUOT. This is our 24-hour learning and unlearning extravaganza to mark the Jewish festival of Shavuot. It is so amazing. 600 folks have registered already. You can become 601, or honestly, maybe 602. Somebody might beat you to it. So hurry to judaismunbound.com/Shavuot. To close this episode, we of course encourage you to be in touch with us in any of the ways that we've got. There's our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram handles. All of those are at Judaism Unbound. There's our website, judaismunbound.com, where you can find show notes for this episode and all sorts of other resources. And you can email us at dan@judaismunbound.com or lex@judaismunbound.com. The last request we like to make is that we deeply appreciate any amount of financial donation that you're able to send our way. And you can do that via either a monthly recurring donation or a one-time gift at judaismunbound.com/donate. So thank you so much for listening. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound.